Let's sew up Heidi, our newest pattern to join our collection, available in baby, girls, and tween sizing. This new pattern features 3 sleeve options, 3 skirt lengths, and also a split bodice style that you can sew with or without the bodice ruffle. So let's get started. Today I am working on the top option with the split bodice style with the adorable ruffle. So you will see we have lining pieces for the bodice and also 2 separate main pieces as well as the ruffle piece to create this bodice. So step 1 is going to be to take our bodice ruffle, which is a nice long piece, and then we will fold up the bottom of one long raw edge by 1/4 inch and then 1/4 inch again, iron it, and then sew it. We will then sew a gathering stitch along the top raw edge of this ruffle piece. Now we are going to find the center of the ruffle and the center of the split lower bodice piece, and we're going to mark those with a pin. Once we have that found, we can lay the bodice ruffle on top of the split lower bodice with the wrong side of the ruffle touching the right side of your bodice and then the raw top edge lining up. Next up, you will pull your gathering threads until the bodice ruffle is the same width as that lower bodice piece that we are layering. You're going to go ahead and adjust these gathers so they're evenly distributed across this top line. And then once you have it the correct width, you can go ahead and make sure that you pin the edges of this ruffle in place so that they do get caught in that seam when we're sewing the arm cycle later on. And now it's time to sew along this pinned seam right here. Now, if you're following along with your written tutorial, we are on step 7, where we're going to place the split upper bodice on top of the split lower bodice with the right sides touching and the raw edges lining up. That bodice ruffle that we just sewed is now sandwiched in between the split bodice pieces. So then we will pin it and sew there. After sewing, then we'll trim off half of our seam allowance and iron that seam allowance up towards the neckline. Now it's time to create the back bodice darts. So you'll start off by just tracing the dart pattern markings onto the wrong side of your bodice pieces. So both of your main bodice pieces for the back and both of your lining bodice pieces for the back. You'll want all 4 pieces to have this dart tracing on there. Our previous video tutorial for sewing up June misses has some great close-up shots of sewing darts, so I won't waste your time showing those steps again, but if you haven't seen them, definitely pull up that last video to check them out. Now that our bodice back pieces have those darts sewn in, we are now going to join our front main bodice and our back main bodice pieces together at the shoulder seams. We'll do that by layering the pieces right sides touching and then pinning and sewing together along that top raw edge of the shoulder. After you have them sewn, you're going to want to iron the seams open flat and repeat that for your lining pieces as well. Pro tip, baste your lining first and then test the fit of that before you go all in with your bodice. This is a great way to make sure that your fit is on point before you actually sew everything together. Now we're going to place the front and back bodice main on top of the front and back bodice lining with the right sides touching and the raw edges lining up. We'll pin together around the neckline and down the back bodice center, and then we're going to go ahead and sew along those pinned seams. Once you have that sewn, we're going to trim off half of the seam allowance and clip notches into the curves or trim that seam allowance back using pinking shears as well as an option. And then we'll turn that bodice right side out and iron flat. You can top stitch along the front and back neckline if you choose to do so at this point. Next up, if you're adding a sash, you can add it at this point. I am not adding one for this version that I created, but you would go ahead and do that at this point if you're going to include that for your sewing option. So now I'm going to open up my front and back lining layers, and I'm going to bring the front and back bodice main and the front and the back bodice lining together at the side seams. Keep in mind, because I am doing the puff sleeve, my assembly is going to be a little different than if you are doing the sleeveless or the petal sleeve option. Once we have both the main bodice pieces pinned together and the lining pieces pinned together, they are pinned separately, you're going to go ahead and sew up those side seams, which joins the front and back main together and joins the front and back lining together. So now you have one full bodice piece. Then you can iron flat that seam allowance that you have created here and turn everything right side out. Now I'm going to get to work on creating the puff sleeve for this. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take one of our pieces and we're going to hem the bottom raw edge of the puff sleeve. To do that, we're going to turn the bottom raw edge up 1/4 of an inch with the wrong sides touching, iron it flat, and then turn it up another 1/4 of an inch and iron flat again. Then we will sew right along that folded edge, and then we're going to go ahead and also add in 1 to 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top curved edge of that puff sleeve. If you have thinner fabric, you can definitely go with just 1 row of gathering stitches, but if your fabric is a little thicker, heavier weight, or maybe a thicker quilting type cotton, you might want to go ahead and do 2 rows of gathering stitches there. Now we're going to get to work on our sleeve elastic casings. So what we're going to do is take these long pieces that we have and we are going to fold each of the raw side of these sleeve casings in towards the middle. We're going to just fold them up by 1/4 of an inch with the wrong sides touching and then iron it flat for both the top and the bottom. Now we need to find the placement for these. So to do that, we're going to take our sleeves and make sure we're looking at the wrong side of the sleeve, so the underside, and we're going to measure up from that hemmed edge of the puff sleeve. It's going to differ depending on your size. Since I'm doing a size 6, I have to measure up 1.5 inches. But like I said, just follow the instructions on step 49 to figure out how far up you need to measure for your size. Then we'll place that puff sleeve elastic casing on top of the puff sleeve with the wrong sides touching and the bottom of the casing lining up with those pins that we marked. We'll go ahead and pin along that folded edge and then sew along the folded edges using a 1/8 inch seam allowance to attach that elastic casing there. Now we're going to simply insert our pre-measured elastic into these elastic casings. And once you've got that inserted in there, you're going to sew along the pinned ends of the elastic to secure that in place. Now, a little tip here, before we go ahead and sew our side seams together of the sleeve, I like to go ahead and make sure that I have noted or pinned or marked one way or another the front edge of my sleeve. As you can see, the front and the back of the sleeve edges are slightly different. And if you don't have that noted well, sometimes it can get confusing and you might insert the sleeve incorrectly into your hole. So I just go ahead and take a little pin and mark which part is the front, so I know that for both of my sleeves, I have the right angle going in. So now we're going to go ahead and fold our sleeve in half, lining up our side raw edges, pin it in place, and then sew along that pinned seam. For a professional look, you can go ahead and finish the seam with a serger, or you can just trim off half of your seam allowance and finish with a zigzag stitch as well. Now we can go ahead and turn those right side out, and then we can get to work on attaching these sleeves into our bodice. To do this, we're going to go ahead and place one of our sleeves into one of the bodice armholes with the right sides of our sleeves touching the right sides of our bodice as well. This is whenever it comes in handy to have the pinned front edge of your sleeve, so you can go ahead and make sure that that matches up to the front of a bodice. We are going to pin all the way around the armhole opening, and then at the gathering threads, we're also going to go ahead and gather those up so that the sleeve fits into that armhole, and pin all the way around that sleeve. Then we will go ahead and sew along that pinned seam very slowly and adjust as needed to avoid any puckers in your fabric. For a professional look, then you can finish this with a serger, or you can then trim off the seam allowance and finish with a zigzag stitch as well. Now we get to attach our skirt. I am doing the peplum version for this, so what I'm going to do is take my 2 skirt pieces that I have, and I'm going to sew them along the short sides to go ahead and create a full circle here. So you'll pin them up here and then sew, trim that seam allowance back, and sew with a zigzag stitch or serge those 2 edges there. Now I will find the center of my back skirt piece, and I'm going to cut it right up the middle to where it ends up having one long line that I can use for the skirt piece. If you're creating a different version of the skirt, you're going to insert a placket here, so it will be slightly different instructions. But for the peplum version, you're going to cut that up the back. So we have one long ruffle piece for the bottom, and we are going to then take the bottom edge of this and hem it. To do that, we will go ahead and turn up the bottom edge of the skirt by 1/4 of an inch with the wrong sides touching and iron flat, and then turn up another 1/4 of an inch and iron flat, and sew along the pin seam. We will also do the same process to the short side edges as well to enclose those edges. Now we're going to attach our skirt to our bodice.
To do that, the first thing that we need to do is find our center of our skirt piece and our center point of our bodice piece. We will go ahead and match up those two center points with the right sides of our skirt touching the right side of the bodice and that long raw edge lining up. So once we have those matched up, what we're going to do is we want to go ahead and gather up our skirt to be the correct width. Now you can take the side seam on this skirt panel and match it to the side seam of your bodice piece, and then you'll gather up evenly in between those sections so that the gathering is even throughout the full skirt width. Now we will sew along this pin seamed, and as stated before, you can either finish it off with a serger for a professional look, or you can go ahead and trim off half of your seam allowance and finish with a zigzag stitch. Then we will iron the seams flat towards the bodice, turn the dress right side out, and top stitch right above that seam if desired.
All that's left to do is add those buttonholes to the back bodice and sew on your buttons. And ta-da! Your Heidi top or dress is ready to wear. Whether you're making it for playtime or picture day, this one's got vintage charm and ruffle options galore. Thank you for joining me with this sew along, and be sure to subscribe for more sewing tutorials. And until next time, happy sewing and keep creating these beautiful things.